Art History 1, Part 7. This is the Romans. Now the Romans we're done in multiple parts. This is going to be the Republic. And in the Republic, the Romans were ruled by an oligarchy of big families. And it was much more of a representative type government than what had happened before and what's going to happen later. Before, they were ruled by kings, and the kings came from the Etruscans, and at some point they overthrew those kings about 500 BC and began the Republic. And it was a very successful government. They grew a great deal. They took over all of the Etruscan territory. They took over all of the peninsula of Italy, and were able to, once they took Carthage, take most of the Mediterranean, and eventually they absorbed the Greeks and their culture, and dominated the whole Mediterranean world up until the point where they couldn't do it anymore until they turned into an empire, and they changed their government to be ruled by emperors, which we'll see later. But before we get to that point, we'll see what the sort of art that they made then. During the Republic, the patricians, the people who were the leaders, it was very important to them. Their ancestors, it added to their status to know their father and their grandfather, back generations, and that they were all rich from, in the past. It added to their status. So, and then they were, their ability to rule was dependent upon that status. So here's an image of a Roman patrician. He's standing holding two portrait busts of his ancestors. One is his father and the other is his grandfather. And together, all three heads are portrait busts. That is, they're made to look like particular people. If you look at their faces, they kind of look like family members. The similarity between them is such that, oh yeah, I can believe that's his father, his grandfather, whichever one it happens to be. But making a portrait bust of a person that has particular features so that you can tell one person from another is not something that the Greeks did. This is something the Romans did, and because the Romans valued that individuality of people, and in their sculpture, in their standing male figures, all of the Greeks, they had an idealized face, a generic face that didn't represent any particular person. So, it was two different values. Yet, when the Romans wanted to make a portrait of somebody, it's not just standing in a normal way. He's standing in a particular way that we've seen before, like this. This is the Polyclitus spear bearer, and this was one from the Greek classical period, and it's when the Romans took over the Greeks and admired their work, they would see something like this and think, "Wow, this is terrific. This is amazing that they did such high level work." So they wanted to copy that, but one thing, just as the Etruscans did, that they didn't do the nudity thing. He was wearing a toga, wearing this kind of outfit, is part of this man's identity as a patrician. This is the kind of toga that they would wear, and being shown in that toga is important. But if you can look through that to the pose that he has, it's very similar to that spear bearer. It has a contrapposto pose. Is one shoulder is low and one shoulder is high, and his hips are probably somewhere in that cloth is also pivoted as it would be with an engaged leg and a free leg, just as the Greeks had done. And so the thing about the Greek sculpture that they're admiring is that pose and that naturalism and the proportions of the figure are all things that the Romans admired. But when they wanted to make an actual work that they're going to use themselves, they adapted that to this, so as to make something that worked with their sensibilities. Having the cloth, and notice the cloth is very well done. I mean, it's you can see exactly how it the texture of this cloth. You can imagine, something made of linen or cotton, the way it crinkles. That is represented in the different ways that the cloth moves over the figure. Even down here, these little decorative lines that come. It kind of reminds you of that Apollo figure from the Etruscans. They're using the cloth as an expressive element to go around the figure and cover up the pose that's consistent with the spear bearer pose. So, one of the things they would also do, this is he's holding a bust made out of stone. It's like it's an official portrait that they would, when somebody died, when the leader of a family died, they would make a wax impression of their face and make a mask of it. They cover it with wax, and when it hardened, they would take it off and fill it with plaster and make a mask. And then that would be something that you would use to show off that you have this ancestor. And I guess over time they would evolve into making them out of stone as well. So this is a mature, developed instance of that kind of thing. And this guy must have had some extra special status to have show himself holding two of them. And this is another thing about this is that when a person went to purchase one of these things from the sculptor, it wouldn't have a head on it, and the heads that are in here would just be blocked out. That is, the sculptor would just make a figure that would be consistent with the kind of thing that his customers would buy, but until a customer came in with an order, they wouldn't yet put the heads on them, and then or the faces, carve the faces into them. And when they needed to, when they had a customer and they says, okay, this is what my grandfather looked like, this is what my father looked like, using these plaster masks, they could sculpt then the details that made those heads. And I suppose in the future, when if they needed to, they could take the head and replace it with another head, if that became necessary. Very practical, the Romans. This instance is a similar sort of thing to give you an idea of what the Romans, how they approached this sort of thing. This seems like the opposite of what the Greeks were doing. The Greeks were, they had generalized faces and that were perfect in every way, youthful, and without any blemish. This seems to be at the other end of the extreme, where they're exaggerating the features that make a person look old, and part of that, the reason for that the Romans wanted sculptures like this is that they wanted an image that's recognizable as the person, because it was important that the fact that you have your ancestor is very important, and that you want to identifiable. So all those features have to be copied from life, or at least from a death mask. And then to add extra the depth of these wrinkles and folds of his face, or it seems like they're almost like a cartoonish version of it. They're really exaggerated because they want to show his age, and I guess the wisdom that comes with that, and that this is a special person, and that they're exaggerating that quality. So now let's move to the architecture. This is Republican architecture, and first thing you notice is this looks more like a Greek building, especially the front end. We looked at Doric temples, but this is like a copy of an Ionic temple, but a smallish one with only 4 columns in the front. If you look at the volutes, capitals, and the fluted columns, it's as though it were a perfect copy of actual Greek buildings. The dentils, the moldings, the entablature, the pediment, all of these pieces look like they would fit perfectly within the Greek tradition. But the thing is, the rest of the building doesn't. That is, the rest of the building has a cella back here, and the columns are sort of engaged within the fabric of the cella back here. Something the Greeks never did, but the Etruscans did have a cella like this with a porch in front of it. And so when the Romans made their temples, they wanted them to be like the Etruscan temples. This is the way they did their temple architecture, having a box back here with a front porch. But because they admired the Greeks so much that they wanted the look of the thing to be as close as possible to an actual Greek building. It has the steps leading up to one end, just like the Etruscans did, so that you don't approach it from any other side. It has an axial orientation. And the columns going around this side, if you look at it, here, let's look at the back. The back, you can see how these columns, as if they've been cut in half and applied to the building, or you can think of it as, you know, full columns that have a wall between them that fill up to halfway within the column. Whichever way you think of it, it's so different than what the Greeks would do. They never thought of doing this, and it would just be outside of their style, the parameters of what they could do in a temple. But the Romans aren't thinking in terms of copying the Greeks, you know, to the letter, only in the decoration. That is, their concept, just as the Etruscans before them, was that the Greek part of their buildings is the surface decoration. Okay. When they became an empire, the Romans moved in this direction. Let's look at the way they did the Caesar. This is Augustus Caesar, called the Prima Porta Augustus. Is the name of it's where the thing was originally for. The Porta is the gateway of the city. This is a figure even closer to the spear bearer in terms of his pose. Look at the engaged leg and the free leg, you know, stepping back and just touching at the toe right there. This leg and this leg, it's almost as if the pose itself comes from the spear bearer, something that they would have, the Romans would have known. But he's standing in a little bit different way, having his arm up like this. Having his arm up like this is an expression that the Romans would understand to mean that he's orating, that he's giving a speech. Looking at his face, comparing this face to this face. This is the Greek ideal type. It has certain features, the way the brow works, the way the nose works in the mouth, and is generic. Like every one of the faces that they did, you know, have the family resemblance to each other. They're all an ideal that developed over time, but it's all very, very similar. Straight nose and all those things. The Romans, because they were so interested in portraiture and that this looked like a specific person who's identifiable, you know, has taken the features of the Greek classical ideal and modified them. So you can still see that brow and the nose, but the nose has a little swell right there and it's a little bit rounded. These must be features that the man actually had. That would be recognizable. In fact, if you look at other instances of Caesar Augustus, whether it's on coins or other images of him, he always looked just like this, down to the fact of having, you know, this lock turning this way and this lock turning this way are identifiable features for this man. You could recognize him. And just as the patrician portraits were, it was important that it be a very specific person and not a generic person. Though within the context of looking like him, it's an idealized version of him. You know, he looked like this no matter what age he was. I think he lived into his 70s, and he still has this look. Another thing is that he's not nude like the spear bearer. He's wearing armor, which is, you know, the things that make him more identifiable. He was a general in the army, so he's wearing armor and the kind of thing that he would have worn to battle. except in this case, it's heavily decorated with all sorts of imagery. Look at the imagery. The relief sculpture on top of his armor to indicate things that make him look more special. That is, it happens that because he's descended from Aeneas, who founded Rome, and Aeneas was a son of a goddess, so sort of a demigod. Then he is related to the gods. And let's look back at the feet here. This figure down here is the son of Venus as well, or Aphrodite. This is Eros, or Cupid, and he's riding a dolphin, and that symbolically represents that part of his family, in the same way that the patrician holding those portrait busts represent his ancestors. Well, this is his ancestor. This is part of his family of the gods, and all these imagery that are on here also relate to show that this is gods are part of his world, and so the Roman portrait sculptor has combined things from the Greeks and combined things from the Roman tradition of ancestor worship, and put them together so you have an individualized portrait of a person standing as if he were the spear bearer, but orating and looking like an idealized version of himself. Okay, let's look at the Aura Pacis. It's called the Altar of Peace. This is a big box made of stone with an altar inside. It's like a miniature kind of temple. It would be outside, though we see it in an interior space here. It would originally have been outside, and it has decorative stuff around the outside, similar to the Parthenon. That is, in the Parthenon, if you remember the friezes on the inside of the Parthenon, with the interior frieze up on the wall, has a procession. This also mimics that look. We will see on the close-up on one of the sides, but from the front here, you can see that they are mimicking Greek architecture using pilasters with capitals, and this pattern here called the meander or Greek key pattern is designed to look, it's like the things they would have on their bases and stuff. So all these elements, even back here, the swags and the cow's skull, are all part of the language of Greek ornament. And they like the Greek stuff, and they put it on the surfaces of stuff, even when it wasn't something that the Greeks would have done. But they didn't feel compelled to do everything exactly like the Greeks. When it comes to making a procession of figures in a relief sculpture, though, they had that model from the Parthenon and others like it, where the Greeks did, a group of people sort of standing or moving forward in a procession for a ritual. But in this case, instead of idealized generic people doing things, these are specific people. In fact, they are the family of Caesar. This is Agrippa and all the different, his wife, his cousins, his different extended family members, and some of them at a young age who will later grow up to be emperors themselves. All are represented standing wearing these togas, using the Greek motif of different depths of relief sculpture. If you look, say, at this one back here is really, really low relief, and this one's a little bit higher, and the ones out here are even higher, almost full three-dimensional effect for the people out front. In fact, look at this one; is his foot sticking out the front. So as to get more of a three-dimensional sense and depth into the relief, which is the sort of thing that goes all the way back to the archaic phase for the Greeks in that battle of the giants that we saw. You can see from this angle how the relief sticks out like this when you see from this angle, and from here, let's see, that would be this figure here. Seeing straight on at it, it seems to be he's coming out of the space. But here you can kind of see how he is it's a bit more artificial. It doesn't read as well from this angle. But the design of the thing is such that all of the figures sort of blend together, because you have all this drapery that's moving and cascading and bunching around all the different places, so they all sort of run together and flow. So you have an interesting rhythm or pattern going across the surface. And all the figures, even though everybody's standing in a contrapposto pose, casual, with knees sticking out on occasion here and here and here, but there's a variety going on. You have some people facing right, some people left, some people with their heads down, others with their heads, I'm looking for, I don't see one with the heads up, but the leveled heads. So that there's a rhythm, from hands to shoulders to arms to hems of their togas as they go around, to create a sense of variety and interest. Also, you have children, and the children aren't just represented as little miniature people. They look kind of like children. They're proportions of their faces, the way they stand, the way they behave, just holding on to this piece of cloth here. I mean, this one does, and this one holding on to his father or something, and another adult reaching down, touching him on the head, sort of keeping him from fidgeting, during a ceremony. It's all the kind of things that you know from real life is things that really occur, and so that the artist has observed those things and wants to depict them. One is because naturalism is part of this, and being really specific to actual people who are recognizable is important. And also, it makes it much more interesting. And I think Caesar probably also wanted to emphasize his family, and just as all the other instances where the family is very important, and the status, maintaining their status. Like if you're going to be the emperor, you want your sons to become emperors as well. So you show them, at a young age that they are definitely part of the family, and that they can acquire the status that you have is when they grow up. All right, let's look at domestic architecture. This is the house of the Vetii in Pompeii. Pompeii was buried under ash from the Vesuvius when it erupted in 79 AD, and it was only discovered much later, and we are able to see it things that other civilizations that came after the Romans weren't able to see, because most of these sort of things, these details of life, had been obliterated by the time, say, the Renaissance came. They didn't have a lot of the detail of the everyday life of the Romans, but we have enough information from Pompeii and other places to see how they actually lived and what their houses looked like. And the thing that we're going to be looking at is one of the decorative wall murals. Just as the Minoans had houses like this and architecture that had the inside their houses, they had the outside that has little atriums and things that were open to the sky, so that rain would fall down and they would collect water, and the whole emphasis of the house was on the inside rather than being something you viewed from the outside. So on the inside they would paint their walls just as the Minoans had. And they would paint them with decorative things, the kind of things you would want in your living room, like the stuff that it's kind of hard to see here. But these look like panels on the probably made of marble or wooden panels or something that they would mimic using paint to fresco on the surface to give the illusion that this is made out of a different material than what they're actually using, and open windows. The illusionism of having an open window. You can look out onto the garden or onto the cityscape. The one we're going to look at is just one that is right here in this one. Seen straight on, you can see that it's a cityscape looking out the window. You've got a column here, and you've got a little bit of wall, that is illusionistically painted, even zigzags. It goes back into space and goes across like that, and has these recessed panels and different colors and stuff, so that you feel as though you're looking out onto the world. And the world you're looking out on is actually a rather convincing thing. We saw with the how the Greeks painted in such a way as to give the illusion of a three-dimensional shape on a two-dimensional surface using light and shade. You can see this column has a little bit of gleam right here where the light is shining on it, and in the tonality of it give you the impression that it's a cylinder, and they even add extra details and decoration on it because you don't actually have to carve a marble column when you're doing this. You just give the illusion of one. But when you look out onto this vista, you can see architectural stuff, and the way the architecture things are represented are as if they're seen almost in perspective. Now we understand what perspective looks like because of cameras and photographs and hundreds of years since the Renaissance, where images of the world were made by people using a system called one-point perspective, and this isn't that. But it's very similar to it in that whoever made this has observed buildings and seen that, when you look at rectangular shapes, that they diminish in space, and that they angle down or angle in such a way depending on your point of view. And you can tell things that are far away and things that are closer in by these angles and the way they work. And even though it's not entirely consistent, like you wouldn't be able to see the top of this building if you were looking underneath this one, since this one seems to be lower than this one. So it's not all seen from exactly one point of view, but it's pretty close for most of the elements in this world. It would be called, I guess, intuitive perspective. That is the perspective, if you were just sitting looking at something and drawing what you see, it's very close to that. And since they didn't really have cameras or one-point perspective, they didn't have the notion that everything had to be seen exactly from one point of view. Apparently the artist wanted to show you what the roof looked like, so he pitched it this way so you could see it. Otherwise, most everything is pretty consistent with a single point of view. And this is the sort of thing that's, it's pretty sophisticated for something that's done, prior to 79 AD. Nothing like this was attempted until the 1300s. All the instances that I can think of from, say, the Middle Ages of people making buildings and giving the illusion of looking out on a vista of buildings like this, none of them have this kind of fidelity to the way things actually look. All right. Let's go to the Colosseum. In addition to being temples, the Romans made big public buildings like this. This is an amphitheater. That is, it's a great big circular amphitheater. Most of the amphitheaters that still exist are only part of a circle or part of an oval, and have a place for the audience and a place for drama and performances to occur. But this is completely in the round. In fact, it's an oval. You can see it from the air. It looks like this. It's a big oval, and it's huge. It's equal in size to a modern football stadium, if not larger, and will hold as many people. Tens of thousands of people could be in here. You can see how it's been it's deteriorated and it's in a ruined state. But you can see what the outside kind of looked like. It's got some pollution making this dark bits, but it would have been gleaming white marble originally. This is its original shape. And it was designed to hold these tens of thousands of people for performances that occurred inside. Here's a painting from the 1800s representing what it looked like on the inside. If you've seen the movie Gladiator, you could see what the inside of the Colosseum was like and the sort of things that occurred there. There's lots of blood sports that occurred, hand-to-hand combat between people. They would have reproductions of battles that occurred, even sea battles, filling it with water. And they would have, all sorts of people dying all the time with either being killed by gladiators or being killed by wild animals. They would bring exotic beasts to come and fight people and give them a chance to fight against them. But lots of people died in here, and they were horrible people to want to see all that. But that was the sort of world that they lived in. The building itself is an oval, as I said. I'm going to show you, how you make such an oval. You start with a vertical and a horizontal line. I talked about before how when you start, say, a city, and you want to orient things north and south and east and west, you use you put a vertical pole in the ground. You make it perfectly vertical using a plumb line, and the shadows that it casts in the morning when the sun rises and the sun sets in the evening, those shadows will be off to one side or the other, and you mark exactly where they occur. And bisecting that line, you can find exactly where north-south is and east-west. And you can use geometry to arrive at a perfect right angle like this. You can also do this on the ground when you're going to make a building, so as to make everything the same reference to a vertical line and a horizontal line. They would do this when they would found a city as well. They would have two streets, the Cardo and Decumanus. That would be the axial streets of a city, and everything else would grow around it, and all the other streets would be parallel this way and this way to those two fundamental lines. So if you were to do this on the ground using a stake in the ground with a long chain and draw a circle, you could make this shape on the ground the size of the amphitheater like this. Then you can use your long chain and stakes as compasses, so as to you take the measure that from here to this outside. When you drew this circle, you measure from this point, and you pull out here, and you cross this circle and find out where that crosses here, and using this as the pivot point here and here, and you mark out this shape. And from this, when you located this mark here and that mark here, measuring your length out this way, you can make an arch across over here. Let's see, from here as a pivot point out to here, you can make that. So that's your oval. And from there, you can change the length of the line. You're still keeping this as a pivot point. You can make different lines out here. So this would be where the rows of seating go. And this, this is the pivot point here. So having the different pivot points, this here and here, create the different parts of the seatings, and you can make the whole thing complete like this, and have your amphitheater made like this. So this kind of geometry that you use to design something is something the Greeks did. Their amphitheaters were done this way, though they had a different system. I mean, it's like their idea of how many divisions that you make and then where you put the pivot points may have differed, but the concept of using geometry to design a thing was a Greek thing. In fact, it also goes back to, it was also an Egyptian thing. Okay. This last work that we're going to have before the midterm is the Pantheon. This is a Roman temple, and it has some qualities of the Greeks and some qualities of the Etruscans. Let's say the Etruscans first, in that it has a front porch and then a box behind it. It had originally steps leading up to the front. It was, with the axial progression to the inside from the center only. You didn't approach it from any other angle. In fact, this part back here would have been hidden in the original configuration. We can see in a model down here. It was designed so that you didn't see what was behind here. That when you approach this, you would think it's just a regular temple, and then when you get inside, you're surprised to see this. or as it was depicted in the 1800s, by Panini, this painting of the inside. It's a cylinder topped by a hemispherical dome, and the height of the hemispherical dome is such that if you were to continue and make a full sphere, the sphere would touch at the bottom. So it's just as high as it is wide. Here's a elevation of it. It's 142 feet across and 142 feet tall. And in the top center is a hole called the oculus. It's about 30 feet across. The dome is made out of concrete, and it's made into these little ridges that go this way that radiate out from the center, and then you have these lines of latitude that go around. And between them, making these squares are recessed, called coffers, these little cubes of space that also, what they do is they diminish the amount of concrete you need, and also the weight that would be tremendous for even this. And this all has to hold up all that weight. It's a very heavy thing, and it's remarkable that they made this at all, because they didn't lead up to this with a sequence of bigger and bigger domes to get to this one. They just came out all of a sudden with this, and it was the first of its kind, and they never did it again. In fact, no one even tried to do anything like this until around 1400 AD. That would be Brunelleschi, who studied this to try to figure out how the Romans had done this. It's one of the things that they did to make it so that you could hold up this dome. Notice the dome is made out of arches. And an arch, if you take it and pivot it from the center around, creates this shape. And the elevation here shows what the interior space of this part, notice, is really, really thick at this point, and it gets thinner and thinner when you get to the top. And the reason for that is because they want to have lots of mass down here to hold up what's above it, and they want to diminish as much as possible how much mass is here. But they didn't have a science to determine this. They just did it by guessing, and apparently they guessed right, because it's still standing. In fact, it's the only thing that the Romans made that is still in almost perfect condition from a moment when it was made, because it's been in continuous use since it was built. Continuing our theme of taking things from Greeks, but maintaining a different kind of structural system on the inside, this building has lots of marble and decoration on the inside that's recognizably Greek. Let's look at a picture here. These are, Corinthian columns, and it's post and lintel. Notice there's a lintel right there, and there's posts, and there's pilasters, and the decorations that, like the little dentils along here. All of this stuff is Greek ornamentation, and it's completely non-supporting. That is, it's only there to look pretty, and doesn't hold up anything. It gives the illusion by positionally that this dome is being held up by columns. These columns are made out of an orange marble. It's very rare and special kind of marble. It's really pretty when you look up close, but it's not very strong. It's very brittle, and it's hardly strong enough to hold up itself. It's certainly not going to be holding up this dome. And above this lintel, there's the weight of what's above it is being channeled away by arches, and those arches are hidden behind these decorative panels of marble, so that the columns don't have to hold up anything. It's just an illusion. And the reason they want the illusion is because they liked the surface decoration of Greek things. And apparently they didn't want to show what was actually behind it, which was a system of arches and things, so as to deflect, like this arch here is deflecting the weight of the dome off of this space, because this air here is not holding up anything, onto the giant piers, which are massive things that are able to, by their compressive strength, to hold up what's going on from above. Here's a close-up of the coffers on the inside. Notice that the coffers diminish the weight, but they also leaving these rib shapes give it much more a structure. Here's what it looks like from the outside. There's these steps on the outside, which apparently are also a strength-giving thing. Also, that it's made of concrete, and they had a special kind of concrete, and it was specifically formulated for this, so as to have the heaviest part down here, where they would add lots of heavy stuff into the concrete to give this a lot of mass and a lot of weight over here. And as they went up, they would diminish that until we got to the top. The concrete here is mixed with pumice, so as to be as light as possible, so as to give less for this to hold up, and also to make it as strong enough so that it will stay up. The way the arch works, normally when you have an arch and you go across, it goes all the way across, and there's a keystone in the middle. And the keystone, by being sort of a wedge shape, just like all the other stones going up the arch, it causes the weight that comes above it and goes down onto the keystone and onto the other wedge-shaped rocks, called voussoirs. They push against each other, and so it is the compressive strength of the stone that is using to resist the force of things to keep it from falling down. But in this case, the voussoirs that would be the keystones are essentially made into a ring. So all the forces that are pushing against this ring are essentially making it push together rather than pushing across. And so by pushing together, it's locking everything. And being open right here means that they didn't have to hold up, this part doesn't have to hold up the extra weight that would be required to fill in this. So the thing that makes it look like a weak thing, having a hole in the middle, is actually a strengthening thing and diminishes the forces that are acting on all these other parts. So that's Greek architecture for the Republic and for the Empire. After the midterm, we will get to the late Empire.